I'm someone who enjoys solitude, which is probably why I chose this house on the edge of the forest, far from the city. It had an old and mysterious aura, just my type. My first days were peaceful. The silence of nature, the chirping of birds, and the rustling of the wind through the leaves captivated me. But one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps echoing through the corridors of the house. At first, I thought it was just the house being old. Wooden floors and walls often creak at night. But the sounds were regular, as if someone was walking in the corridor. I got out of bed and listened carefully. The sound stopped after a while. I was scared, but I told myself it was just my imagination and tried to go back to sleep. The next night, the sounds came back, this time closer. I went out into the corridor, and it seemed like something was moving in the dark. I took my flashlight and illuminated the corridor, but there was nothing. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself. But with each passing night, the sounds became more distinct and threatening. One night, I decided to muster up the courage to find the source of the sounds. Armed with my flashlight and a knife, I began to explore the house. The sounds led me to the basement. The basement was dusty and dark, as if it hadn't been used for years. I carefully descended the stairs and reached the lower floor. As I scanned the area with my flashlight, I found an old door. When I opened the door, I realized I had entered a hidden room. The room was filled with old and mysterious objects. Shadows danced in the reflection of a broken mirror. Strange symbols and writings covered the walls. These symbols, which I couldn't quite understand, sent chills down my spine. The room seemed untouched for years. In a corner, I found an old book. The cover of the book bore strange symbols and the title, "The Truth Behind the Shadows." When I opened the book, it described a ritual. The ritual was about controlling the passage of spirits and shadows into the world. Suddenly, the air in the room grew cold and the lights began to flicker. I wanted to close the book and retreat, but my steps wouldn't move back. A force had trapped me in the room. I closed my eyes and began to pray. Suddenly, the shadows in the room started moving and took on human-like forms. The shadows seemed to be waiting for the completion of the ritual described in the book. At that moment, I remembered the stories I had heard about the previous owner of the house. The former owner had mysteriously disappeared and never returned. He must have summoned his spirit by following the ritual in the book. I decided to complete the ritual, thinking it would either save me or trap me among the shadows forever. As I completed the ritual, the shadows grew more intense and the sounds became more distinct. When I uttered the final words, the shadows in the room came together to form a colossal figure. The figure was the silhouette of the man who had once owned the house. His spirit had been freed through the ritual. As the man's spirit thanked me, I looked at him with tears in my eyes. Slowly, the spirit blended into the shadows and vanished. From that moment on, the sounds in the house ceased and peace returned. But I never forgot what happened that night. Discovering the truth behind the shadows had become a curse for me. I didn't leave the house, but I never went back to the basement. As for the book, I kept it hidden, perhaps for someone else to discover this secret one day. However, I have seen the truth behind the shadows, and it has changed me forever. In the silence of the house, I still carry the traces of that night. The shadows gave me a secret, and I continue to live with it. It all started when I inherited my grandmother's old house at Hollow Creek. Nestled in a remote part of the countryside, it had always been a source of mystery and intrigue for me. My parents never spoke much about it, and visits were rare. When I arrived, the house was just as I remembered, grand yet decaying, with ivy-covered walls and a gate that groaned when pushed open. On the first night, after unpacking and settling into my grandmother's old bedroom, I felt a strange unease. The house was filled with the scent of dust and old wood, and every creak seemed amplified in the silence. I brushed it off as just the typical sounds of an old house and went to bed. Around midnight, I was awakened by a soft humming sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was a melody, a lullaby that my grandmother used to sing to me when I was a child. The haunting tune drifted through the halls, pulling me out of bed. I followed the sound, feeling a strange compulsion, as if the house itself was guiding me. The melody led me to the attic, a place I had never been allowed to explore as a child. The door was slightly ajar, and with a deep breath, I pushed it open. The room was filled with old furniture, dusty paintings, and cobwebs. In the corner, I saw an old rocking chair slowly moving back and forth as if someone had just left it. As I stepped closer, the humming stopped abruptly, and the room grew cold. I felt a chill run down my spine. There, on a small table next to the rocking chair, was a photograph of a woman I didn't recognize. She had a stern face, with eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. The back of the photograph had a date, June 15th, 1925, and the name Eleanor. My curiosity piqued. I spent the next few days researching Eleanor. I went through my grandmother's old journals and letters, piecing together a story. Eleanor had been my great-grandmother, and according to the journals, she had died under mysterious circumstances in the house. There were whispers of a curse, of tragic events that befell anyone who lived there. As the days passed, the humming became more frequent, and I began to see glimpses of a figure out of the corner of my eye, a woman in a long, flowing dress. I could feel her presence, a constant, unsettling weight in the air. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a prison, with Eleanor's spirit haunting every corner. One stormy night, as the rain pounded against the windows, I decided to confront the apparition. I took the photograph and headed back to the attic. The door was open wider this time, as if inviting me in. The rocking chair was still, and the room was deathly silent. "Eleanor," I called out, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" A cold breeze swept through the attic, and the rocking chair began to move again. Suddenly, the lullaby filled the room, louder and more intense than before. Shadows danced along the walls, and the temperature plummeted. In the flickering candlelight, Eleanor's ghostly figure appeared before me. Her face was pale, and her eyes were hollow, filled with a sorrow that seemed to reach out and grip my heart. She pointed to the floor, where a loose floorboard lay partially uncovered. With shaking hands, I pried the floorboard loose and discovered an old leather-bound diary. It was Eleanor's. The pages were yellowed with age, but her handwriting was still legible. The diary detailed her life in the house, her joys, her sorrows, and the events leading up to her death. Eleanor had been accused of witchcraft by the townsfolk, driven by fear and superstition. They had come for her one night, dragging her from the house and leaving her to die in the nearby woods. Her spirit, bound by the injustice and the pain she had suffered, had never found peace. Tears filled my eyes as I read her final entry, a plea for forgiveness and a desperate wish for someone to know the truth. I knew then what I had to do. I promised Eleanor that I would clear her name, that I would bring her story to light. The next morning, I went to the local historical society and shared Eleanor's diary. It took months, but eventually, the townsfolk came to understand the truth. A memorial was erected in her honor, and her name was finally cleared. On the night of the memorial, I returned to the house one last time. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. As I stood in the attic, I felt a warmth envelop me, and for the first time I saw Eleanor smile. Her figure slowly faded, and the house grew silent. I left Hollow Creek that night, knowing that Eleanor's spirit had found peace. The house, once filled with sorrow and fear, now stood as a testament to a story that needed to be told. And though I would never forget the haunting nights, I found solace in knowing that justice had been served and a restless soul had finally been set free. I awoke to the sun shining through the slit in the curtains and an odd feeling. When I sat up, I was struck with confusion when I saw my surroundings. This wasn't my house. How did I end up passed out on the floor in someone else's home? Okay, think. What happened last night? I said, rubbing my head in what seemed like a futile effort to make the memory return. Just then, something clicked. The party. My friends and colleagues held a party in celebration of another successful book completed. Did I really drink that much? No, it wasn't that. I knew what a hangover felt like, and this feeling I had wasn't that. Something didn't feel right. I didn't feel right. It was as if something was missing, but I just couldn't put my finger on it. I went to stand up, but froze at what I saw next. I saw blood that smeared and stained the hardwood floor. I jolted to my feet and searched my body for any cuts or scars. I found nothing. If I wasn't the one who had been hurt, then that meant that someone else was here with me, possibly bleeding to death. I shoved my hands in my pockets, rummaging around for my phone so that I could call for help. Searching my pockets for the phone led to no avail. I looked around the room once more to see if there was a phone that I could use. I saw nothing. I explored my unfamiliar environment only to find that there were no phones whatsoever in this house. Maybe if I went outside and found the neighbor, they could help. I looked outside and saw that I was in the middle of nowhere. I had no neighbors to call upon. This was bad. I had to find the other person and get out of there fast. I looked everywhere. Opening door after door, I looked in bedrooms, bathrooms, upstairs. I called out to the person hoping that they would yell back and I could pinpoint their location. I heard nothing. Suddenly, out of the nothing, I heard a truck pull up outside. I ran down the hall in a panic. I came face to face with yet another door. It was open, though, and I could only assume that, at the time, it led to the basement. I heard footsteps making their way to the front door. I entered and quickly made my way into the darkness. I tried to be as careful as I possibly could while descending the steps into the pitch-black basement. As soon as my foot touched the floor, I heard the door upstairs open, then slam shut. "Honey, I'm home, and I've got a surprise for you," he shouted as I heard footsteps making their way to the basement. I stumbled around, trying to find a place to hide or something to hit him over the head with. Just then, I tripped over something. I hit the ground, then started feeling around to see if I could figure out what it was. I grabbed a hold of something, someone's foot. For a split second, I was relieved to have found the other person. It was still kind of dark, so I couldn't really see much, but I was able to make out the shape of a girl sitting in a chair. "Don't worry," I whispered. "We'll get out of here soon." Our captor was at the threshold of the basement. I turned around, looking for a place to hide. Something caught my eye. I saw the tools that were sprawled out on top of a table glistening in what little light had filled the room. I scurried under the table and pressed myself tightly up against the wall. I saw a bat leaning against the side of the table. When he wasn't paying attention, that's when I'd make my move and get both of us out of here. He turned on the light when he hit the bottom step. The captor came into view. Well, the bottom half of him anyway. He was wearing dress shoes and a tux. I saw the girl a little more clearly now. She was covered with scars. Her skin was a sickening tint of white from the amount of blood that she lost. Isn't it beautiful? Well, it's not nearly as beautiful as you are, though. The unknown man draped a silky white dress over the girl and got down on one knee. The edge of the table was just barely covering his face. He took her hand and slid a ring on her finger. The way her arm dropped to her side reminded me of a rag doll. I wondered how she could be so calm and so still in this situation. That's when I realized the grim fact that she was dead. I let out a gasp, then quickly covered my mouth in an effort to stop the noise. The man didn't seem notice. "You've made me a very happy man, you know that? I mean, we've had our moments, but I never stopped believing that we would be together someday." I listened closely to him. He sounded very familiar. Did I actually know this psycho from somewhere? He stood up and made his way toward the table. I slowly extended my hand towards the bat. He He shuffled through his tools for a second and finally found what he was looking for. A book dropped to his side. My book. He turned around, gave the corpse a kiss on the cheek, and made his way toward the stairs. Now was my chance. I gripped the bat and shot out from under the table. When I was right behind him, I closed my eyes and swung as hard as I could. After a moment, I opened my eyes and saw him standing not 3 inches from my face. I jolted back and fell. I closed my eyes again and started frantically swinging. "Get the hell away from me!" I kept waving the bat around, hoping that when I opened my eyes again, he would be laying face down. I stopped for a second and hesitantly opened my eyes. He was still standing, looking straight ahead at the body in the chair. How was he still standing? How could he not have noticed me screaming and hitting him with a bat? "I'll let you get ready," he said, before turning around and making his way up the stairs. After seeing his face, it hit me. He was at the party. I could have sworn that I saw him at the party. He was one of the waiters. He brought me my drink. Then, the rest is kind of fuzzy, but I vaguely recall him carrying me out to the truck. Then I was here, and he took the bat and... Wait, the bat. I got ready to swing again, only to find that I wasn't holding it. I looked back at the table, and there it was, propped up against the side. But I could have sworn that I had grabbed it. What the hell was going on? Then I saw something that explained why I couldn't grab the bat and the feeling that I had earlier. That feeling that something was missing. I soon realized that what was missing was a heartbeat when I saw my body sitting in the chair with the forehead bashed in. It had been 6 months since the accident. I remember because Elizabeth was helping me sign my name in our daughter Jenny's birthday card. Slowly, she guided by hand, helping me create some legible signature rather than the scribbles of a child in kindergarten, the best that I was able to manage with such little practice. It seems that when one loses a limb, it's quite likely to be the dominant one. For me, it was the right. I was concentrating on my writing, trying not to make her do too much of the work when I felt it. I hadn't noticed the phantom feeling of my elbow resting on the table beside me. By this point, I had almost gotten used to it, although the pain would sometimes still wake me. It was brief, but enough to startle me and cause my hand, still holding the pen, to jump and effectively turn my name into scribbles despite my wife's best efforts. It was gentle but cold. Too cold. Less like ice and more like the feeling of a deep cut when the insides of a body part are suddenly exposed to the outside elements that they were never supposed to meet. When Elizabeth asked, I shrugged it off, telling her it was an unexpected pain in the hand that was convinced it was clenched, even though it didn't exist. At the moment, I almost believed that that was what happening myself. The next time it woke me. I was asleep on my stomach, with my phantom arm dangling off of the bed. I've slept like that as long as I can remember, and when I first felt it, I thought that my hand had fallen asleep and causing the pins and needles sensation that I had often felt. When I tried to open and close my hand, I awoke, remembering in a sleepy haze that I didn't have a hand to open, yet the cold feeling remained. This time it stayed a while, and I could make out the distinct feeling of fingers on my skin. I tried to shake my hand, but couldn't. I pushed down with my left hand and shifted to roll over onto my back, yet the feeling remained, still as defined, and I wondered how long this invisible hand had held me. I shook my wife awake and explained, but she was convinced that it was simply a part of the process. She held me and talked to me in her cooing, comforting voice until, one by one, the fingers lifted, releasing me from the torture of the cold. Feeling it reminded me of the accident. There was a blizzard and Elizabeth was driving. As a truck approached the car slid, she tried like hell to control it, but it seemed to have a mind of its own. I grabbed the wheel, spinning the car until it came to a stop. Then the truck hit us. My arm was mostly severed at the time of impact, but my wife and daughter were fine. The feeling of blood escaping you chills you to the bone, and that was exactly what I was feeling while in this creature's grasp. For months it happened, with no warning or reason. The doctor said it was just the phantom limb, that it was to be expected. No one understood that something was wrong. Sometimes it would last days at a time, and those were the days when I would stay in bed, watching TV, trying not to focus on the hand around my wrist, trying not to think of the thing that was holding me. Sometimes its grip would loosen only to tighten again, as if the hand that didn't exist was sore from holding my hand that didn't exist for so long. Then one day, it stopped. For a month or so, nothing happened at all. I had gone from living with an unknown entity at my side every day to finally being free. We lived it up during that time. We went everywhere, from the Grand Canyon to Disney World. It had been forever since we had the opportunity to spend time as a family again, and we enjoyed every moment we had, grateful to have suffered only a small loss to our family. We had opened the cafe again, and my wife was doing what she loved. My daughter and I were at the cafe. It was closing time. She and I sat at a table outside while Elizabeth closed the register, chatting about the upcoming middle school dance. My wife joined us and locked the doors. "Want to come with me?" she asked, patting the bag of money in her hand awaiting deposit at the bank across the street. Jenny jumped up, eager, no doubt, to get one of the suckers from the candy dish that the bank kept at its counter. "I'll warm up the truck," I said, fishing my keys from my pocket. My wife nodded in approval and walked me to the truck, kissing me on the cheek through the window after I entered, and again on glass after I rolled it up. They headed down the length of the truck, and I turned to check the mirror when I saw it. A truck barreling down the road heading straight for my wife and daughter. I screamed her name and threw the door open when the hand that wasn't there was suddenly jerked to the opposing side of the truck, holding me in place as I kicked and screamed. The kiss on the glass of the window was the last I ever got, and the hand never let go again. The house I grew up in was right next to a set of busy railroad tracks. From my bedroom window, I could watch the trains roll by. There were 3 types of trains that used those tracks, and still do to this day. There were the long, lumbering freight trains pulling boxcars, flatbeds, and tankers, which I would try and count as they clattered by. Then there were the fast-moving commuter trains of the Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, aka MATA, or the M, as some people call it, and Amtrak passenger trains that would breeze by, heading to and from the central station in the heart of the city. Now, when most people see trains, they just see big machines rolling down ribbons of steel. But me, I saw trains as symbols of freedom and a way out of the hood. Whenever I saw a train, I would imagine all the places it was going to and coming from. Naturally, my favorite toys as a tyke were my Thomas the Tank Engine toys. I had all the characters: Thomas, Percy, Gordon, James, Toby, Daisy, all of them. When I was 10, my grandparents bought me a Lionel train set for my birthday. To me, it was the best present ever. It consisted of a steam engine and 4 passenger cars. There was even a small bottle of drops you'd put in the smokestack that allowed the engine to make smoke. I'd spend hours watching that toy train run around in an oval, pretending it was real, and that I was driving the locomotive through forests, past fields, across mountains, and past small towns. I eventually developed other interests, namely girls, but I still never lost my interest in trains. When I got older, I applied for a job as an engineer trainee on MATA and got it. For me, it was a dream come true. After I took the required classroom courses and exams, I soon found myself riding in the cab of the sleek diesel engines that pulled the commuter trains. Now, the way the trainee program was set up was that they'd have you ride on the different lines of the system for a few months with a regular engineer. I'd be on one line for a few weeks, and then I'd be assigned to another line in order to be familiar with the different routes. The M has 8 routes, all numbered. The main line is Line 1, and all the branch lines are Line 2, Line 3, and so on. I started on Line 7 the first few weeks before being moved to Line 8. Now, Line 8, or the Cloverton Line as it is sometimes called, is one of the longest branch lines on the system, second only to Line 2, aka the Millersport Line. The first time I rode on Line 8, I was with a veteran engineer named Hank. Now, Hank had been with the company from the beginning, when the old railroads decided they wanted out of the money-losing commuter services and handed all their locomotives and rolling stock to MATA. We had the night owl service, which starts at 7 p.m. and ends at 5 in the morning. We picked up our first passengers at Central Station and were soon on our way to Cloverton. As we were going down the track, Hank turned to me and said, "There is something you should know if you're going to be working for this railroad, especially if they decide to put you here on Line 8 once they make you an official engineer." I looked at him and said, "Oh, and what's that?" Hank paused to blow the horn for a crossing and then said, "This line is haunted." I replied, "Haunted? How's the line haunted?" Hank looked at me and said, "It supposedly started with a curse. Back in the late 1800s, when one of the old railroad companies was building the line, the company built the line across the edge of an old farm that belonged to a man named Ezra Gray without his permission. Ezra demanded that the railroad remove the tracks from his property and relay them somewhere else, but the railroad refused, due to it costing too much time and money to do so. Mr. Gray did try to sue the railroad, but was unsuccessful. You see, railroads were quite powerful back in those days, and the railroad had a lot of politicians and judges in their pocket. To add insult to injury, Ezra not only had to pay the court costs, but had to pay the railroad as well for all the money they spent on the legal proceedings. This bankrupted Ezra, and he was forced to sell the farm, minus the small patch of land the tracks were built on, and Ezra Gray vowed to get even one way or another. When the line later opened up, Ezra stood on the tracks in front of the first train. The engineer tried to stop in time, but Ezra was hit anyway. Before he died, Ezra cursed the line, saying that it would bring death and sorrow. Ever since then, there were a lot of mishaps and accidents on these tracks, and many people lost their lives. It is believed that some of those who died haunt various spots, and that a few of the trains that crashed over the years come back as ghost trains, still rolling along these very rails we're on now. I looked at Hank as he blew the horn for another crossing. "Have you seen any ghosts on this line?" I asked. "Plenty," he said. "I've seen everything from headless trainmen to phantom lights and ghost trains." I didn't believe him at first, but didn't say anything. We eventually came to a curve in the track, and when we came out of it, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Coming at us was the headlight of another train. "Hank, for God's sake, man, put the brakes on!" I shouted. "Don't you see the other train coming our way?" Hank responded, "Yeah, I see it. Don't worry, we'll be fine." I looked at Hank and screamed, "Are you crazy? We're about to die." Hank just pointed straight ahead and said, "No, we're not. Get a good look at that train." I did, and saw that not only did the oncoming engine have the shape of one of the older type diesels, like you see in photos, movies, and TV shows from the 50s and 60s, but it seemed to be a transparent shadow with a headlight and lighted cab windows. "What the?" I started to say, but then that shadow train hit us. Well, not hit us exactly. More like passed through us. Our whole cab was surrounded by shadows and streaks of light as what looked to be a passenger train passed through, and I swear I saw the pale, wispy figures of people sitting in the seats. Soon it was gone, and the cab of our engine returned to normal. "What the hell was that?" I exclaimed. Hank turned to me and said, "That was one of the ghost trains I was talking about." "Well, what's the story with that ghost train?" I asked. Hank sighed and said, "Well, it all happened shortly after MATA was established and took over the commuter rail lines. An evening inbound train had just crested the long grade we're on right now when it lost control and ran away, all downhill, before crashing and piling up on the curve at the bottom. Everyone on board was killed, and the cause of the wreck was blamed on the aging equipment MATA was using back then. Heck, with only a few exceptions, most of the engines MATA got from the old railroads were 25 to 30 years old, and about 30% of the coaches used were even older. Not long afterward, the ghost of that train started making appearances along this stretch of track, becoming one of several ghost trains that haunt these rails." I looked at him, then out the front window of the engine. "What about the people back in the cars? Do you think they just saw what we saw?" I asked. Hank just shrugged and said, "Probably, but I'm sure most of them are used to it, so I wouldn't worry too much. Our conductor is probably taking care of things right now." We continued on to Cloverton and arrived on time. We made runs back and forth all night, and several times I saw some of the scary things that Hank told me about. I was relieved when we finally tied up in the yard, leaving the coaches on one of the side tracks, and put the engine in the roundhouse. The next few nights, however, were hell. Every night run, I had at least a few creepy encounters along Line 8, all of them with Hank, who would just shrug them off as if they were nothing. But I guess that after nearly 40 years, none of the ghosts bothered him anymore. After a few days, I was put on the day runs, which was a relief to me, and didn't have to worry about seeing ghost trains or headless trainmen again. I eventually became a regular engineer and was put on the main line run. I'm pretty content, but if the big wigs for the M ever decide to put me on the Line 8 Night Owl service, I'll quit. I am currently alone working a night shift at a hospital morgue. I work as a cleaner, which means I've seen, smelt, and heard horrific things. I started a year ago, but strange things have only started recently. I want to document what's happened tonight. Firstly, the porters brought a recently deceased man down to be processed into the freezers. I did the paperwork and put him into the freezer until examination tomorrow. The freezers are empty apart from this man, as the funeral home collected the rest earlier. This is important. I sat down in my office, which overlooks the freezer drawers and examination table. I started playing chess until I look up and see the door to the freezer open. I went in and shut the door, creeped out, but thinking maybe didn't shut it properly. I sat down again and continued my game of chess. I won the game around 5 minutes later, so I looked up and the freezer door was open again. I knew I locked the door, so at this point I was very creeped out. I looked around the empty hallway to check no one was there, and as I thought it was just me and a dead body, or so I thought. I locked the door again and went back to the office. I was so uncomfortable being near the ROM and felt like I was being stared at from the corners of the room. Suddenly, a door crashed into the wall behind me, like a rhino had just barraged into it. I could barely breathe from fear and grabbed for the radio to call security. I turned back to the room overlooking the examination table, and there was a woman's body on the table. I dropped the radio and screamed all the time, staring at a body that shouldn't have been there. Like I said earlier, there should be only one body here, the man's. After catching my breath, I radioed security and they thought I was joking. About 5 minutes later, one security guard shows up confused as he looks at this body. The toe tag says died 1994 at Queen Royal Hospital. The year is 2016 in Dr. Wright Surgical Hospital. How is there a body from 22 years ago lying on the table? We called the police, but when we had our backs turned, the body disappeared from the table as quickly as it arrived. We both went into the room, but it was empty. I had this feeling of dread come over me as I checked the freezers. Bay, 1 empty bay, 2 empty bay, 3 empty bay 4 had clothes in. The man's clothes, but he was gone. I went to tell the security guard, but he wasn't there. I looked everywhere until I tried to radio him. The radio never had any batteries in. Who was the man who showed up? Where did he go? How did he make a dead radio work? All these questions, but no answers that will ever come. After tonight, I'm never coming back. But whatever happened here tonight, it's attached itself to me. I feel more heavy, like I'm carrying someone on my back. I'm having thoughts that aren't mine. Deep within the heart of the forest, nestled among ancient trees and overgrown foliage, stood the abandoned asylum. Its imposing facade loomed over the landscape, a testament to a bygone era filled with whispers of madness and suffering. For years, the building had remained untouched, a relic of darker times that beckoned to those daring enough to venture close. I had heard tales of the asylum since childhood, stories of inexplicable occurrences and unsettling echoes that resonated through the night. Despite warnings from locals and the chill that ran down my spine at the mere mention of its name, curiosity eventually got the better of me. Armed with little more than a flashlight and a trembling resolve, I embarked on a journey to uncover the secrets hidden within its walls. As I approached the asylum, a sense of foreboding washed over me. The air grew thick with a palpable silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant call of nocturnal creatures. The moon cast an eerie glow upon the dilapidated structure, illuminating broken windows and crumbling walls that seemed to lean inwards as if whispering secrets to each other. Pushing open the heavy wooden doors, I stepped into a world frozen in time. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch and contort with each step I took. The hallway stretched out before me like a labyrinth, doors lining both sides with faded signs that hinted at their former purposes. Treatment rooms, administrative offices, and patient wards. The first room I entered was a maze of overturned furniture and tattered curtains swaying in the draft. Among the debris, I found remnants of old medical equipment and patient records scattered like leaves on the floor. Each document told a story of despair and hopelessness, of lives interrupted and sanity lost. As I moved deeper into the asylum, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. Shadows danced along the walls, their movements accompanied by whispers that echoed through the corridors. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet seemed amplified, as if the building itself was alive and watching my every move. In one particularly dimly lit corridor, I heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. My heart raced as I followed the sound, each step bringing me closer to the heart of the asylum's darkness. The air grew colder, and a chill ran down my spine as I reached a door at the end of the hall, its surface marred with scratches and faded paint. With a trembling hand, I pushed open the door and stepped into what appeared to be a forgotten library. Dusty shelves lined the walls, their contents a jumble of decaying books and yellowed manuscripts. A single table stood in the center of the room, upon which lay an open journal with pages yellowed by time. As I leafed through the journal, the words revealed a chilling tale of medical experiments conducted on unwilling patients, their suffering meticulously documented by the asylum's doctors. Descriptions of screams in the dead of night and the agonized cries of those subjected to torturous procedures sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight and plunging me into darkness. Panic seized my chest as I fumbled for matches, my hands trembling uncontrollably. In the darkness, I could feel a presence lurking just beyond the reach of my senses, its malevolence palpable in the air. With trembling hands, I managed to strike a match and relight my flashlight. The room remained empty, yet the feeling of being watched persisted. Determined to uncover the truth, I continued to search the asylum, each room revealing more horrors than the last. Hours passed like minutes as I navigated the labyrinthine corridors, my mind racing with fear and adrenaline. I stumbled upon rooms filled with decaying medical equipment and patient wards where the faint echoes of laughter and cries still lingered. It was as if the walls themselves held the memories of those who had suffered within them, their anguish etched into the very fabric of the asylum. As dawn approached, I found myself standing once more in the asylum's entrance hall, my body weary and my spirit shaken. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the broken windows, casting a golden glow upon the abandoned corridors. With one last look back at the asylum, I knew that I had uncovered only a fraction of its secrets. The asylum stood as a silent sentinel, its dark history buried within its crumbling walls. As I turned away and began the long walk back through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered behind me, watching, waiting. The echoes of the asylum's past would haunt me forever, a reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of even the most tranquil landscapes. In 1987, a building agency was tasked with dismantling the old Renfield farm. It had a dark history of violence and horror. The farm was owned by a family of serial killers in the 60s until a shootout with the police, until the police shot a gas tank which started a horrific fire in their home, and all that was left were bones. Scattered around the farm were bones which the police didn't know if they were human or animal. The family was reported numerous times by passers-by as animals without eyes or legs were seen being paraded around by the father. That was only a start to what the family did whilst living there. The builders moved their equipment and machines into the property a week before demolition. However, before demolition started, a potential buyer off the property surveyed the land interested in its brutal past. The buyer walked around the farmhouse on his own until he started running back to his car screaming. He got in his car and sped off and was never heard from again, leaving the owner of the land confused. The potential buyer was found mutilated, with no eyes or legs. The week started as scheduled, and the builders started arriving early, but had to wait for the boss to arrive. He arrived 10 minutes late to find his annoyed colleagues waiting. The crew had over 20 people in it, so the boss registers who's present. Much to his surprise, 3 of his most loyal workers were missing. He carried on dishing out the tasks to 3 groups. Group A was to start clearing the barn. Group B was to start demolition on an old barn at the back of the property. And Group C started on the main house. They all had radio comms, which the boss checked in on them every 30 minutes. 30 minutes went past, and the boss radioed Group A, and there was no reply. He radioed the other groups to see if it was his radio not working, but they all responded. He walked over to the barn, and it was empty. Nothing had been touched, and it looked like no one has been there in years, apart from a few drops of blood. The blood was fresh, not dried. The boss radioed Group B, no reply. He tried radioing Group C, no reply. The boss knew the history and was terrified and ran to his car. He got in his car and drove up a dirt path to leave, but he was stopped in his tracks. His workers were all dead and dismembered, lying in a row in the middle of the road, and standing in front of them was the Renfield family. They had a sick grin across their face, and there was more of them than in the 70s. Suddenly, the boss was dragged out of the car and hit over the back of the head. The next time he woke up was in the hospital with no eyes or no legs. The boss was also found with a tattoo stating, "Renfields never die." The police carried out an assault on the farm with airborne bombs and drone explosives. All bodies of the family were recovered, and then the police figured out how all those years ago how they escaped. A series of tunnels under the property fill with bodies each mile. The officers who cleared the scene all left their jobs and never returned home, but filled in this report, which is how we know so much. No one knows what happened to the officers, and the government doesn't acknowledge the officers disappearing. That was years ago, but the local government is set to build a house there on the grounds of the farm for the new mayor. The mayor insists he lives there. The mayor's name is Rick Narenfields. You see the name and what it has hidden in it. I can't let what happens to my dad happen to anyone else. Yes, I know so much 'cause I'm the boss's son, and history will not repeat itself. Missing Boy's diary entry entered January 15th, 2018. Went missing January 16th, 2018. My friend Janice and I had known the carnival was coming to town for weeks. She tried to get out of the cramped trailer she lived in with her parents as much as possible to avoid her alcoholic father. My father worked so much to try to make ends meet that he barely noticed me anyway, and my mother was sick with cancer, a skeletal figure who lay in her room dying in front of a constantly flickering TV. My little brother, Brent, who at 9 was 2 years younger than me and Janice, followed me like a lost puppy, begging me to come to the carnival with us. Finally, a few minutes before we left, I acquiesced. We met Janice under the brightly lit sign curving overhead. It read, "Pogo's Carnival and Rides." People streamed in and out in packed crowds, pushing past us as the dusk crawled in overhead. I saw Janice had a nasty purple bruise on her left arm in the shape of a hand. She saw me looking and nervously pulled her sleeve up to her wrist. "What happened?" I asked. She shook her head. "I just fell off my bike," Janice responded coldly, not meeting my eyes. "You sure do fall a lot," I observed. She gave me an icy glance as we headed toward the ticket booth. "It's because girls can't ride bikes," Brent exclaimed sagely. I had saved my allowance money for weeks to be able to come to the carnival. I pulled out the wad of crumpled $1 bills from my pocket, counting them out and handing them to the tattooed man behind the glass partition. He waved us through, and with that, we were inside. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The three of us stopped to get friend dough and slushies on the way to the rides. In the no man's land between the food stands and the rides, there was a line of tents stretching out in both directions, most of them covered in brightly colored canvas. One of them caught Brent's attention instantly. It said, "Rosemary's Tarot," and had an enormous blown-up picture of the hanged man in front of it, his face radiating a beatific light as he hung suspended upside down on the cross. "I want to see the future," Brent exclaimed excitedly, hopping up and down as if trying not to wet his pants. "Can we go?" I nodded. Janice rolled her eyes. "Those things are all scams," she said. "It's just like fortune cookies. All they do is say stuff so vague that it could apply to nearly anyone." But she followed us inside, past the purple covering of the tent, and into an inner chamber lit by hundreds of black candles formed in a semicircle around the perimeter. An old woman with a face like a withered raisin sat there, staring up at the ceiling with glazed, faraway eyes. She looked at me when she heard the jingling of the change in my pockets, but at the same time, it seemed that she looked through me. "Good evening, children," she said in a voice as dry as old leather. "Have a seat, and let's see what the stars have in store for you." Nervously, the three of us sat in front of the woman. I handed her a ticket. She inspected it for a long time with her owlish blue eyes before secreting it away in an inner pocket of her many shawls. She pulled out a very old, very worn deck of tarot cards, placing a thin hand carefully on top of them. Her eyes rolled back in her head. In a strange, wavering voice, she droned, "Oh, spirits, let us see the true nature of all things. Let us show these little ones what hides behind the veil." She pulled the cards out, placing them on the table before us in a cross shape, her eyes widening with each one. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. "Oh, children, I am sorry to say the stars are not in your favor. There are great trials in store for all of you," she said, her eyes hooded and unreadable as she flipped over one card after another. "The Devil card. It shows that you will be tempted by a powerful spirit. You must not be led astray. Do not throw away your immortal soul for a few moments of folly. The Death card shows that you will have a radical change in your life. But death is not only an end." She flipped over the rest of the cards faster and faster, her eyes flying open as she stared down at them. She inhaled sharply. "All of you children are in great danger," she said, all the blood draining from her face. With trembling fingers, she massaged her temples, running them in slow circles over her forehead. "I have never seen such horrific omens for such innocent little ones. Beware of those who come to you wearing masks upon masks." At that moment, a loud crack reverberated through the air, as if a firework had just exploded outside the tent. A long moment of deathly silence followed it. Then the screaming started. "Call an ambulance!" a woman screamed in a high, shrill voice ringed with panic. "Oh my God, someone help him!" My brother Janice and I jumped up at the same moment, running out of the tent to see the cause of all the commotion. The old woman yelled something after us, her thin, trembling hands still held over her worn tarot cards. But we ignored her. There was a crowd gathered around a tent across the way with the face of a grinning clown plastered on the front of it. The people murmured in a soft voice as two security guards came speed-walking over, their faces pale and covered in sweat. One of them raised his hands, trying to push the people back, but they milled around like sheep with open mouths. "A man just shot himself back there!" One of the security guards yelled over the single voice of the crowd. "You all need to back up! This is a crime scene!" Off in the distance, I heard the faint wailing of sirens. There was a break in the crowd. Under the bright glare of the carnival's lights, I saw the body of the man. Half of his face was gone, just a ragged patch of bloody, glistening muscle and bone. His right eye was missing, but his left still stared up blindly at the mannequin of a clown wrapping a rope around the plastic body of a young boy. "The rope trick," blood-red letters exclaimed overhead. I looked above the grinning face of the clown on the outside of the tent, seeing what kind of spectacle it advertised within. "Pogo's serial killer memorabilia," it read. "See the original VW bug of Ted Bundy. Behold the actual rope John Wayne Gacy used to strangle his victims. Look at Lawrence Bittaker's real pliers, still covered in his victim's blood." The security guards pulled a crying woman from the tent. She looked shell-shocked, her wide, unseeing eyes sweeping over the crowd over and over. She kept muttering to herself. "He said he would bring him back, healed," she wailed in a stream of insane gibberish. "He promised!" The police came in a few minutes later, pushing people aside in their rush to get to the man. I saw paramedics trailing after them. Brent was jumping up and down excitedly, trying to see. "I want to see the clown tent," he exclaimed loudly, drawing disapproving looks from the shocked people around us. I shook my head, pulling him away. Janice followed close behind me. "There's a dead guy in there," I said. "You don't want to see that." "Yes, I do," he answered excitedly. "I want to see the body." I felt sick all of a sudden, pulling my little brother's arm. "No, you don't. Maybe we should just leave," I said. Janice looked pale as well. She nodded. "Yeah, that was kind of," she began, her voice trailing off. A clown stood there waving at us next to the brightly lit rides, his face a mask of red and white paint. He looked identical to the clown I had seen in that serial killer tent, the one doing the rope trick, which apparently involved strangling someone while they were bound and helpless. "All right, let's go," I said, grabbing Brent's wrist and pulling him alongside us. He whined as we left, but not about the rides. I glanced back, seeing the clown still staring eerily in our direction with a grin like a slice from a knife. "I want to see the dead body." Brent kept crying over and over as made our way home. We left by the front gate, circling around to the dirt trails behind the carnival that led their way back towards downtown. Dozens of police, ambulance, and fire trucks were still assembled at the front. It was already well past dusk, but a full moon illuminated the trail in a pale, skeletal light. Janice and I were quiet, lost in thought, but Brent was still jabbering excitedly. "Wait until I tell my friends that a man killed himself at the carnival," he said. "So cool!" Janice came to an abrupt stop in front of me. I looked up, shocked at what I saw. A black cat hung there. Someone had wrapped a thin metal cord tightly around its neck, biting deeply into the flesh. Its mouth hung open, one eyelid half closed, the other staring ahead with frozen terror and agony. Its left ear looked short and ragged, as if a piece of it had been bitten off but healed over time. I noticed its front right paw was missing as well, though this wound looked fresh. A sharp piece of ragged bone poked out through the folds of mutilated, clotted flesh. "Oh no," I whispered, feeling sick and weak staring at it. I looked over at Janice, seeing the same horror reflected on her face. Her bright blue eyes had started to tear. I watched as a silvery tear wound its way down her cheek. Behind us, I heard the cracking of a twig. I turned, seeing a brightly dressed clown standing there, red hair stuck up in points far above his wide, friendly face. Even through the striped blue and white clown suit, I could see he was extremely fat with squinty, pig-like eyes. White makeup covered his head, with red paint accentuating his eyes and mouth in sharp points. He looked eerily similar to the clown that had been waving to us, but I couldn't be sure if it was the same one. The clown's excited grin faltered when he saw the dead cat hanging there, swinging from side to side in the light breeze. "Why would you children hurt such a helpless little creature?" the clown asked in a deep, raspy voice. "Do you children have no compassion for the small and defenseless?" He slowly ambled towards us, his extra-long red shoes thudding against the ground. His dark eyes narrowed into angry slits. I thought the clown would smack me in the face for a second, but instead he only stood there. A moment later, he leaned forward. Like a sleepwalker, the clown reached into his pocket and withdrew a curving silver dagger. I backed away, afraid he would cut my throat, but he just walked past us. He neared the cat, slicing it down with practiced ease. I heard the blade whip through the air and the wet thud of meat as the cat's rigid body hit the carpeted floor of leaves. The clown lifted the rope, swinging the dead cat in his right hand from side to side, staring fixedly at the three of us. "What's your name, kiddos?" he rasped, his painted face still grim and unsmiling. "I'm Max, and this is my brother Brent, and this is Janice," I said, taking a small step away from this strange figure. The clown leaned forward, the cat bobbing in a wide arc around his feet, its blue tongue sticking out of lips that looked like they might have been silently screaming. "Okay, Mr. Max, Mr. Brent, Miss Janice, I believe you," the clown said seriously, pulling a white canvas bag out of seemingly nowhere with his left hand. The white gloves he wore made soft swishing sounds as he waved it, causing it to expand with the rush of air. He never took his eyes off of us, never seemed to blink. But what are we to do with this little guy? He never hurt anyone. He didn't deserve this, did he? Janice and I shook our heads in unison. Brent just stared open-mouthed at the tall clown grinning down at us. Abruptly, the clown ripped open the top of the canvas bag. With a ferocious smile, he shoved the cat headfirst into the white canvas bag. I heard its bones break with dull popping sounds, like the cracking of branches as the clown struggled with the rigid corpse. I gasped, horrified at what I was seeing. Janice took a step back, looking like she might turn and run at any second. I wasn't too far behind her at that moment. "We will send him to the gardens where pure rivers flow and the sky sings with music. He will drink deeply from the fountain of life and come back, healed," the clown said, his eyes growing distant and far away as the cold body of the cat finally slipped inside. At that moment, I thought that we had certainly encountered a madman. But then something strange happened. Once the cat disappeared into the bag, the clown pulled the drawstrings on the top shut and gently laid it on the ground. He got on his hands and knees before the still canvas bag and breathed into the small black opening left in the top. Brent nervously disappeared behind me, grabbing my wrist tightly. I watched the clown carefully. At that moment, I thought I saw something like black smoke flitting between his painted lips under the moonlit sky. Suddenly, the bag was writhing and jumping on the ground. The clown yanked open the drawstrings, and the black cat came running out, alive and filled with frenetic energy. To this day, I would swear on my life that it was the same exact cat, the one I had just seen hanging rigid and dead from a cable tied to a tree branch. It had the same white spot on its back in the same position, but now its ear and mutilated paw were healed, the flesh there looking totally unharmed and new. It gave us a terrified backwards glance, its wild, panicked eyes roaming over me and Janice and falling on the clown. As soon as the cat saw the clown, it emitted a screech of mortal terror, hissing and spitting as it disappeared into the bushes. "How did you do that?" Janice asked, open-mouthed. The clown gave a wide grin. His eyes appeared black, the irises so dark that they simply faded into the pupil. He raised a white, gloved hand above Janice's hand. I could see that it had specks of the dead cat's blood spattering its palm. "First, let me introduce myself," the clown said in a theatrical manner, swinging his white canvas bag in a circle. "I'm not only a clown, but also a magician. The magic I practice is more than just tricks and illusions, however. I tap into the source of all things." He tapped my heart as he said this. "People call me Mr. Hands." He raised his ridiculously large white gloves for emphasis, getting a small chuckle out of me and Brent. "Okay, Mr. Hands," Janice said skeptically, her eyes coldly scanning his face. "If that was a magic trick, how could you have possibly prepared it? Did you kill a cat and keep a replacement one in your bag?" He laughed, reaching into his canvas bag and pulling out a bouquet of black roses with sharp spikes. He got one knee, handing them with exaggerated theatrical swagger to Janice. I am sorry you would think such a horrid thing of me, Mr. Hand said, his lips forming into an exaggerated frown. But, Miss Janice, how would I have possibly known that a man would shoot himself in the carnival, causing you three to have to leave early and come down this exact forest path? She scowled, her eyes narrowing. You're right, she whispered. How did you know a man shot himself? I asked suspiciously. Have you been following us? I see everything, Mr. Max, he said, and his eyes seemed to glow with a pale inner light. I blinked, and it was gone. I wondered if I had imagined it. I have real magic within me. My only goal in life is to bring that magic to the sick and weak. I love healing, but I can only heal those who go beyond the veil and come back. Do you see? I glanced over at Janice, seeing the confusion I felt reflected on her face. No, I asked. If you have real magic within you, can you heal my mother? She's really sick. And my daddy, Janice said, looking down at her bruised arm. Real magic is in the heart, in the soul, Mr. Hand said. It comes out like rushing water. You can feel it ripping its way through your body. It is pure power and happiness. But it seems wrong, I said. Are you saying that they need to be strangled like the cat to be healed? Mr. Hands laughed uproariously at that, slapping his massive gloved hand down on my shoulder. No, of course not, Mr. Max. People have more dignity than animals, he said, and like a magic trick, the curving silver dagger appeared in his hand. The knife is better, much more personal, just a quick slice across the throat. He drew a long finger across my jugular at this, and then I'll bring them back, totally healthy and healed, just like the cat. I travel around the country helping children like you. Many have seen miracles beyond imagining. I'll do it, Brent whispered next to me, his eyes wide and hypnotized. He held out a small hand to the clown. With a grin like a knife blade, Mr. Hands placed the dagger into Brent's palm. No, Brent! I yelled, jumping forward to stop him, but I felt a hard shove from behind. I went flying forward, my head slamming hard into a rock. I groaned, feeling the air get knocked out of my lungs in a great whoosh. As clouds of blackness descended over me, I saw Janice standing over me, her eyes wild and scared like those of an animal's, her lips set in a grim line of determination. I awoke in the darkness, feeling something cold and sticky on my forehead. I raised my head gingerly to my temples, wincing. When I drew them back, they were covered in slick spots of scarlet. For a long moment, I lay there without thoughts, wondering how I had gotten here on this dark forest trail. Then my memories came rushing back. I inhaled sharply as I remembered Mr. Hands. I quickly pushed myself up, my head swimming. A splitting migraine worked its way down my skull, but I stumbled forward, pushing myself towards downtown where Brent and I lived. Janice lived in the same trailer park, only a few rows down, so I hoped I would be able to stop both of them before something horrible happened. I didn't know exactly what Mr. Hands had planned, but I didn't trust that sharp smile or those gleaming eyes. I saw the lights in the distance, and with the last of my strength, pushed myself in a blind sprint towards my home. I sprinted through the trailer park. Normally, people would have been outside, drinking or smoking or sitting and talking, but tonight, it looked totally deserted. Janice's trailer was on the outskirts of the park. I hoped against hope I would find her and Brent there and be able to talk some sense into them. They seemed to follow Mr. Hands like sleepwalkers. I flung open the door, smelling the rank odor of old beer and stale cigarette smoke. The entire place looked as dark as death, except for a flickering TV in the far room. Terrified, I whispered into the shadows. Janice? Brent? I said. I had a little flashlight attachment I always kept on my keychain. With trembling fingers, I pulled it out, shining its weak, pale beam around me. I crept towards the TV, past a kitchen overflowing with dirty dishes and empty beer cans and liquor bottles. On the couch, I saw Janice's father. For a single heartbeat, I thought he might have just been sleeping, passed out drunk. Then I saw all the blood soaking into his shirt. His throat had been slashed from ear to ear, nearly decapitating him. His pale, watery eyes stared up blankly, the smell of blood and alcohol thick in the fetid room. I heard hissing from behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin as I turned to see the closet door open. Hundreds of pale, skeletal hands emerged from it, creeping towards me on emaciated arms that lengthened and stretched. A scream caught in my throat as I backpedaled, afraid to look away from the monstrous scene. The closet swirled with black shadows. The space itself seemed to stretch and distort into an abyss that ran impossibly deep, extending into an eternity of empty, dark space behind the writhing arms. I heard Janice's voice, echoing out of the darkness as if from very far away. It had a pleading, insane quality to it I had never heard before. "Bring him back! You promised!" she wailed. The reverberation stretched out, and it almost sounded as if the voice was growing far away, like Janice was being dragged deeper into that abyss. I heard Mr. Hands' laughter, but it no longer sounded as if it were coming from a human mouth. It shredded and deepened like tearing metal. It gurgled with a sick, demonic ringing. I covered my ears, trying to block out the horrible sound, but it seemed to penetrate my skull like a drill. My back hit the front door of Janice's trailer, but the hands kept coming. Hundreds of arms covered in purple and black necrotic sores reached out towards me. They extended 20 feet, then 30. They kept coming, the white bones of the arms cracking and reforming with nauseating crackling sounds. I fumbled for the handle, too petrified to look away for even a single moment. The hands were only inches away, the fingers grasping like greedy mouths as they clenched at the empty air. I felt my palm brush the handle, heard it click behind me. The first of the skeletal fingers grabbed at my clothes, feeling as sharp as scalpels. I fell back, hearing my shirt rip. I looked down, seeing small slices all over my chest and stomach. Scrabbling away on all fours like an animal, I fled, hearing Janice's agonized screams echoing eerily off in the distance, sounding as if they came from another world. The laughter of Mr. Hands accompanied it, as lifeless and cold as a black hole. I tore through the dirt roads of the trailer park, not seeing a single person in the dark, lonely night. There wasn't a single insect chirping or bat flying overhead. The place looked as dead as the crater of a nuclear wasteland. I flung open the door to my home, hearing the distant whispering of voices. I heard Mr. Hand's grating laughter. I stopped at the kitchen sink on the way, grabbing a soiled, serrated knife, its gleaming silver surface still covered in spatters of spaghetti sauce. Sprinting blindly through the trailer, I followed the sounds into my mother's room at the back. She was surrounded by machines, her body looking as sunken and starved as the victim of a death camp. Her enormous eyes stared out from a skull-like face, glassy and wet, as they looked up at Brent with pure love. "Brent," she whispered in a voice as wispy as smoke. Brent was pale and nervous, standing next to the looming figure of Mr. Hands in his brightly colored outfit. The face paint on Mr. Hands' cheeks and eyes seemed to have changed since I last saw him. It looked much sharper, formed into curving spikes, almost like the Gacy mannequin in the carnival tent playing the rope trick on an unsuspecting victim. "Mommy, I don't know if you can understand me, but Mr. Hands is going to make you better," Brent whispered as a tear slipped down his cheek. In his trembling hands, I saw Mr. Hand's curved blade gleaming brightly. "She will go to the gardens and drink from the water of life and come back renewed," Mr. Hand said, putting a comforting gloved hand on Brent's shoulder. "Go on, Mr. Brent. Save your mother." "No!" I screamed, running forward, but Brent didn't even look up. He prepared himself, his small body tightening with action. In a blur, the knife came down, stabbing into my mother's throat. Her hands clenched, her eyes widening as she stared up confusedly at Brent, waves of searing agony ripping through her expression. A last breath like a hiss escaped from her mutilated neck before she started seizing, her limbs kicking and twisting in jerky movements. Mr. Hands slowly walked back towards the open closet, removing his gloves with practiced ease. Underneath, I saw 2 rotting hands with black and purple sores eaten into them. A sadistic grin split his face like that of a skull. The darkness inside seemed to glow, emanating a sickly purplish light. Brent could only stare open-mouthed at the bleeding, dying form of his mother, but I saw it all happening. "Don't let him get away!" I yelled, but Mr. Hands disappeared into the glowing darkness in a flash, backing into the shadows and disappearing. The many bright colors of his clown form spiraled and dissolved as the shadows ate his body like a corrosive acid. As Brent stared in horror at the writhing body of our mother, the knife he had plunged into her neck quivering in time with her thready heartbeat, he gave a scream of primal horror. His eyes looked glassy and unreal, like the painted-on eyes of a plastic doll. A forest of hands reached out, hundreds of pale, grasping hands on inhumanly thin arms that disappeared deep in the shadows. I reached out, slashing blindly, but no blood came from the mummified limbs. Thick, black sludge like a car's waste oil dripped out instead, their dark surfaces shimmering with rainbows as they spattered on the ground below us. I grabbed Brent's thin wrist, dragging him away as he continuously screamed in horror. We had nearly made it to the door when the hands reached out, greedily snatching the air to grab Brent's small body. Thousands of fingers like razor blades approached, the sharp points of bone at the end swiping wildly at the 2 of us. Brent still struggled against me, crying for Mr. Hands. "Mr. Hands promised he would make Mommy better!" Brent wailed. "Let me see Mr. Hands! Let me go!" "Mr. Hands is a goddamn demon, Brent," I hissed, slashing at the arms that drew near. My heart palpitated wildly as the first of the fingers closed around Brent's wrist. Dozens more came reaching out toward me. I felt a vicious slash down my chest. 3 hands tried to dig themselves in my skin, leaving deep gouges that instantly bubbled over with blood. I cried out, falling back as my bloody shirt ripped off my body. Brent followed me, landing on the floor in front of the door. "Help me!" Brent cried, tears and snot streaming down his face. The many cuts on my body burned like acid as I groaned. My head swam, the pounding migraine from earlier returning with a vengeance. I looked up to see Brent starting to slide towards the closet, a single skeletal hand wrapped around his wrist. Dozens more streamed in to help. I crawled forward, feeling 1,000 small agonies screaming all over my flesh. I raised the knife, bringing it down onto the arm holding Brent with a sick crunching of bone. The hand holding his wrist tightened. I heard the small bones snap like twigs in Brent's arm. His face went chalk white, and for a moment I thought he might pass out. As the inhuman arm spurted black blood, I dragged Brent towards the front door, both of us covered in blood and injuries. His hand hung limply from his arm at a sick angle. We fell out together into the warm night air. More hands followed us out as we crawled away, a furious demonic scream echoing all around us in the voice of Mr. Hands. We fled, the arms stretching out of the open door towards us. Staggering, holding each other, we made our way out of the trailer park and found help. A few minutes later, I heard the first of the sirens approaching. This happened decades ago, and to this day, Janice's body was never found. My brother was arrested for the murder of our mother and committed to a psychiatric institution until he was 18. We tried to tell them about Mr. Hands, but no one believed us. There was never any evidence that another person was present at the murder, at least according to the police. I still have nightmares about that grinning clown with a smile like a knife blade to this day. And I wonder how many other gullible kids he convinced to murder for him. For in my heart, I know there must be thousands of other victims.